I am a widescreen junkie. I'm so fascinated with anamorphic lenses and the shape of a screen. It's the only real area I pay a lot of attention to when it comes to cinematography. Aspect ratios literally shape your film and help you tell the story. I'm not one of those people that just finds an aspect ratio and kind of sticks with it. It depends on what type of film I'm telling, whether I'm telling it in a 16:9 aspect ratio, your standard television one, a 235 aspect ratio, a 276 aspect ratio, like Which Way They Walk, or even 200, which I have recently fallen in love with. Even 220, that I've even shot a few things in. Because aspect ratios, as I said, shape your film and help tell your story. And I really hate it when I see people slap on the Cinemascope bars at the top and bottom of your 16:9 screen just to make something look more cinematic. And then there's a lot of people who think that doing that just makes your screen smaller. Well, when you're adding a matte onto a regular 16:9 frame, yes, you are indeed making your frame smaller. A lot of people don't realize that when you're shooting an actual anamorphic widescreen, your screen is just that much bigger. The black bars at the top and bottom of the screen are not actually added in. Your frame is literally that big. The 16:9 frame would fit within the aspect ratio bars of whatever given aspect ratio you're shooting in terms of anamorphic. If the story calls for that aspect ratio of 235:1, by all means use it. If it doesn't, then don't. For example, I could not picture Ghidra, the three-headed monster, in any other aspect ratio other than 235:1, the standard Toho scope that they were using. I could also not picture Gettysburg, my second favorite film of all time, being in any other aspect ratio than 178:1, which is your standard 16:9 frame. That was also shot on 3-per film. The 1950s brought about this widescreen phase in cinema, though we've had it for a long time, starting with Cinerama. Cinerama was a needlessly clunky yet really grand widescreen format developed in part by Marion C. Cooper, the father of King Kong. Basically, you had 3 35mm cameras rolling at once. This was cumbersome and made filmmaking almost impossible. The reason for this is because you had to focus 3 cameras at once, and because of that you could not slap any other lenses on top of it. So you only had one lens to use the entire film, and oftentimes eye lines would not match because you have a curved screen. And though Cinerama in its true form, seeing with 3 projectors, is really awesome. I got to see a re-release of This Is Cinerama. It was really an extraordinary experience. I can understand why directors such as John Ford and Hathaway there on How the West Was Won almost could not make the film. It also is unbelievably expensive because for every frame you're shooting it 3 times. So it costs literally triple the amount of a normal film. 20th Century Fox then bought Cinemascope, which is pretty much where we got the standard aspect ratio of 235:1. Paramount had VistaVision with 185:1, which Hitchcock used a lot, if you're ever wondering about that. To name an epic that's very well famous, The 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston was shot in VistaVision. There was also the advent of 70mm film, which made your film stock much bigger, which meant larger screens, but were also more expensive. You had Todd A.O. with Cleopatra and Patton, that was a 2:20 aspect ratio. You had Super Panavision 70 with Ben-Hur, and it was even recently used on The Hateful Eight. It's also done in several films, including Battle of the Bulge. And you even had Technorama, which was 70mm, which was 8-perf film stock. So literally, for every shot that you're doing, you're spending literally double your money, so you have half the footage that you normally would have, but that was shot with films such as Spartacus. Your normal 35mm frame was 4 perforations thick. These were all extremely expensive, and with the digital age, it is even more so. A problem a lot of people found with anamorphic is that it had a small depth of field, and you could not really get that close to your actor. Close-ups were extremely hard to do. It was the director of photography of The Fog, Dan Cundy, who said it isn't good for close-ups, it's how you fill the rest of the space. It is why a lot of directors like Stanley Kubrick and Sidney Lumet really shied away from using anamorphic lenses. The regular spherical lenses let them have more freedom to capture their vision with their directors of photographies. And it makes sense for them to do that. They were that kind of director, and they tend to really like using close-ups and very detailed shots, so it makes sense why they would shy away from anamorphic. Anamorphic is also clunky. It warps your image. We'll get into that a little bit later. And you have to be careful with lighting because you get a lot of really crazy lens flares, which sometimes looks great, especially if you shoot it in like a music video. But for an entire film to have that, that's insane. And it's quite messy. Most of television for a long time was shot in 3-perforation film instead of 4-perf film. I think this is called Super 35mm, but I could be wrong. Don't quote me on that. All I know is that Star Trek The Undiscovered Country was the only one of the Star Trek films not to be shot on Panavision of the original 6 films, and it was shot on Super 35 3-perforation film to save money. And because it's 3 perforations thick instead of 4, you can save 25% of your budget on film stock this way, and so it made sense. Television is also a lot cheaper. You don't have anywhere near as much money for television, though that's certainly changed now, and with the advent of digital, but back then it made a lot of sense. Digital largely replaced this. Even 16mm was too expensive to use by now. With digital having taken over, and let's face it, it has, I have to admit I find myself desperately wanting to shoot with film and see more films actually shot in a film format. And it's just not economical anymore with digital projectors. The workflow of our technology and playback systems, it's all digital. So it makes a lot of sense why directors of photographies and even movie studios, be them big conglomerates or little tiny indies, would go for shooting digital on even little cameras such as your Canon 5D. Canon 5Ds can still get great imagery. I mean, look at The Social Network. A large chunk of that was shot on a 5D. Look at Slumdog Millionaire, shot on a 5D. A lot of House, that show, shot on a 5D and 7D. You get some great images with those. So I began to look around for something that could possibly be economically friendly. That's the big one, economically. Yet still capture a good look that isn't 16mm film, which is still extremely expensive. And I came across something very interesting. I came across the process known as Techniscope. I always wondered how Sergio Leone managed to capture such intimate close-ups with the widescreen aspect ratio of 2:35:1. Well, no one else really did, and no one else really does today when shooting anamorphic. Hell, the shot is even known as the Sergio Leone shot, where you have a close-up cutting off the top of the head and the lower part of the chin of a person within the frame. So what is Techniscope? It was developed by the British, but largely used by the Italians because it was so economically viable, yet still created a widescreen image that became the standard for cinema, thanks to the 1950s. Techniscope takes a standard 4-perf 35mm film frame and literally cuts it in half. The result is, instead of a 4-perf shot, you have a 2-perf shot. This naturally allows you to either cut your budget for film stock in half, or you can spend the same amount of money for twice as much footage. Techniscope also allows DPs and directors to use their cheaper and more accessible spherical lenses. It allows you to get great close-ups and manages to also keep your depth of field intact, which is something that Sergio Leone did a lot. He uses depth of field great in all of his films that he used Techniscope to shoot in. There's also no distortion, which is common with anamorphic lenses. I told you I would get back to this. Usually with anamorphic, you'll see the sides of the frame be slightly squished while the center frame is slightly more rounded and flat. Usually straight lines also appear to be warped inwards a bit too, though this literally almost completely went away with the advent of Panavision, but especially when we had CinemaScope in the 1950s. If you watch films like The Robe, you can definitely see it, especially when you see Victor Mature's face when he's in the center of the frame. He looks almost fat. But anyways, that's not of a big of a problem when we reached the 1970s. It was just in the 1950s and 60s. It was quite common. Again, Panavision took care of a lot of this situation. The reason you can use spherical lenses is because, in terms of Techniscope, is because when you cut regular 4-perf 35mm frame in half, the image has two perforations naturally. It creates a rectangular image immediately. So you have two options when projecting your film at this point. You can either project it with a Techniscope projector, or more commonly, print the film on a standard 4-perf 35mm film strip, elongated the image to fit the 4-perfs from 2-perf, and project it through an anamorphic projector, which was far more common and, to be honest, a little more easier. You can show it in more films that way because by the 1960s, almost every movie theater in the country, at least in the United States and in Europe, were equipped to show anamorphic widescreen films. The drawback here is that you are now doubling the film grain content, but often it was compensated by making it a part of the aesthetic of the film. Sergio Leone certainly did this, and Sergio Corbucci certainly did. A lot of the Hammer horror films that did it certainly did. The Abominable Snowman of the Himalayas, that certainly used the grain to a bit of its benefit. What's another Techniscope film I can think? Robinson Crusoe on Mars. Insane film, but I highly recommend it. That uses the grain content to its advantage. That was shot in Techniscope. And it is something I certainly would do as well if I was to shoot something in Techniscope. I like grain. I'm sorry. You can call me a hipster for that, but I do. I think it just adds texture to your film, to what you're trying to make. Hammer used this process quite a bit, starting with what I believe to be the Abominable Snowman of the Himalayas with Peter Cushing. A really good film. I highly recommend it. The Italians used it a lot too, taking advantage of their cheap labor laws, which let them make extravagant strongman films such as Hercules, The Colossus of Rhodes, and countless others. It also allowed films like Ben-Hur and all that crap to be made over there. Which, by the way, speaking of those strongman films, many of which I find are actually pretty good and very lavishly done and pretty well crafted in terms of aesthetics, it's just hard to find an un-AIP dubbed copy of those films. The AIP dubs were often altered. They often altered the scripts significantly to the point that those films, in their original form, do not even resemble the American cuts whatsoever. But anyways, the movie versions of the hit TV series Thunderbirds, the puppet show, was shot in Techniscope because they couldn't get in close enough with anamorphic lenses to capture the puppets properly. They are silly films, but do check them out. Loads of fun. But Techniscope let them place the cameras simply like how they did on the TV show, yet still capture a grander, wide image to fit that of a movie screen. I say bring it back. You need to use certain kinds of cameras capable of accepting the 2-perf film stock, but with all the money spent on countless RED cameras, Arri Alexas, and 35mm film in general, you'd still come up in the green if you use Techniscope. And we've used it recently too, and I mean just Techniscope. Argo and The Blind Sign were both shot in Techniscope. I'm not sure if it was called Techniscope, but it was the 2-perf 2:35:1 aspect ratio cut. And it was shot with spherical lenses on 2-perf film, then scanned into a computer, which naturally gave both films the 2:35 aspect ratios without having to squeeze it like you normally would when you plug it into a video editing software. It has become my favorite film format because it just seems so accessible and economically friendly now. You can still use IMAX 8-perf films on big productions like Dunkirk or anything by Christopher Nolan, but yet use Techniscope on the smaller, more intimate pictures. In fact, Techniscope is born for intimacy. Like, even look at the Sergio Leone films, even though those are big, just look at those close-ups. That is the definition of intimacy. It would also allow filmmakers to create a film look because you are shooting on film, and not have to go through hours and hours of painstakingly trying to recreate the look in DaVinci or any other color correction program like I've been having to do lately. I love Techniscope so much that I wrote an epic called Amor, which means love in Spanish. It takes place during the Spanish Civil War and is basically the Odyssey, but with the backdrop of the Spanish Civil War and Franco instead. I could not picture myself using anything but Techniscope to shoot that movie, especially since I saw Duck You Sucker, aka A Fistful of Dynamite, directed by Sergio Leone. That movie is huge. It's like on David Lean levels of huge. But yet it was shot in Techniscope, and the grain was exactly what I want. We spend so much money on cameras and equipment today in Hollywood. Would shooting a film in 2perf Techniscope be more expensive than renting 8 Reds? No, it wouldn't. And I say it's high time we use some of it. I know Airy has a Techniscope camera they rent out. I also have friends who shot in 2perf film for their short films, and I am so jealous I wanted to scream. Does this make me a bit of a hipster? Probably. Who am I kidding? I love film, and though I'm nowhere near as pompous as most cinesque people are, I certainly can be snobbish when it comes to certain films. I'm sorry. But I couldn't help but notice all these filmmakers trying so desperately to recreate the film look while shooting on digital. And I say Techniscope is a good happy medium between 35mm film and digital. It's just been so largely forgotten about, and I do honestly think if more filmmakers knew about this process, they would use it instead of going for 16mm film, and still save a lot of money in the process. Go on Facebook, like AN Productions, for all up-to-date information we're doing there. Follow our website, follow us on Twitter. All the links are in the description below. And in the end, this is Adam Noyce of AN Productions saying sayonara.